All right, let's call the meeting to order. Can we get a roll call, please?
Sure. Good evening, everyone. Chairman Dibble,
Present.
Vice Chairman Schrader,
Present.
Commissioner Zarguni,
Present.
Commissioner Miller will be absent, Commissioner York,
Here.
Commissioner Gonzalez is absent right now, Commissioner Mandel,
Here.
Commissioner Salazar Garza,
Here.
and Commissioner Munoz.
Here.
Quorum established.
All right. I guess, can I get approval of absences?
Make a motion that we approve the absences of Chairman Dibble and Commissioner York for the March 23rd meeting.
Do I have a second?
Second.
All right, I have a motion and a second. All in favor, say aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? All right, item number 4, approval of minutes from the Planning Commission meeting on March 23rd. I know y'all have had a chance to review the minutes. Do I have a motion to approve?
Motion to approve the minutes from last meeting.
Commissioner Munoz makes a motion. Mandel, seconds. All in favor, say aye.
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 Any opposed? All right, item number 5, I guess we need to open the public hearing on any general items outside of anything specifically listed, so I'd like to. Do what? Does anybody care to make public comment? There being none, I'll close the public comment period and turn it over to Mr. Demas for consent agenda.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. For the record, Andrew Demas with Development Services. To read in tonight's consent agenda, beginning with item number 2 under new plats, Tyler Subdivision, Block 4, Lot 16, a final plat of .138 acres. And item number 3, South Texas Bone and Joint Medical Plaza, Unit 1, Block 1, Lots 2A and 2B, a final of 4.32 acres. Staff finds that the plats meet all conditions of the Technical Review Committee as well as the UDC and Texas Local Government Code, and we recommend approval. The item number 4 under time extensions, this is the first request for Highway Village Section Number 1, Block 3, Lot 2R, a final of 1.24 acres. And that concludes the items on tonight's consent agenda.
Mr. Demas, if possible, can we do items 2 and 3 first? Commissioner York needs to abstain
Sure.
from item number 4. So can I get a motion to approve items 2 and 3 under? Any public comment? There being none, I will close the public comment and we'll take it for motion to approve items 2 and 3.
Make a motion that we approve items 2 and 3 as presented.
Second.
All in favor, say aye.
Aye.
All opposed. Motion carries. Commissioner York has left the room. Would you mind rereading item number 4 for us?
Not a problem, sir.
Thank you.
That is the first request for a time extension for Highway Village Section Number 1, Block 3, Lot 2R, a final of 1.24 acres.
Are there any questions for staff on item 4? All right, at this time, I'd like to open the public hearing for item number 4. There being none, we'll close the public hearing. Can I get a motion?
I'll make a motion that we approve item 4 as presented.
Second.
I have a motion and a second. All in favor, say aye.
Aye.
Any opposed?
All righty, moving along to our non-consent, we have 3 related items, both surrounding Cal Island South plat. The first is item number 5, which is Cal Island South preliminary of 117.29 acres. This is a recommendation for conditional approval. The conditional is surrounding drainage right-of-way. So what the comments you'll see in your packet, and those are also explained along in item 6 and 7, which I'll read in separately, but that involves the developer having to acquire additional drainage right-of-way to handle capacity, or as part of their public improvement process. So as you know, after a plat is approved, public improvements are then submitted for utility construction. The applicant would have to demonstrate that the drainage capacity can be handled by the drainage that's available on site. So either they acquire or they prove via engineered drawings that capacity can be handled. And that is why it is conditional for both items 5, 6, and 7. But that's starting with item 5, which is just the preliminary plat.
I've got a question.
Yes, sir.
So this area is, I've got a huge concern about how this area gets developed from a drainage situation, because the drainage canals on both the north and the south of this, they essentially can't access because basically this property is a bathtub, for lack of a better term. I mean, you've got drainage canals that you can't dump water into because their flow line, their access to these canals is higher than the property that's being developed, and then you've got a railroad track to the east. So I'm concerned about the conditional approval. How does that work as far as, I mean, in other words, if they don't get the proper access, the conditional approval is moot, correct?
Correct.
So this is, in other words, this is not in any way granting them getting them any closer to having that, allowing them off the hook on that situation by giving them conditional approval.
Correct.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, along with Schroeder, Commissioner Schroeder there, I too am concerned about the drainage. That area there already seems to be an area that doesn't have a good flow of drainage, and now with all these additional, I think it's what, 411? Yeah, that sounds like quite a bit. However, you're mentioning that this is just a preliminary plat, and we'll be able to find out a little bit more on when they do construct.
Even that it's a preliminary, it's by no means an approval's ever a blank check. So even if you were to just say approved, no conditions attached, they're still bound by their public improvements, the engineering aspect, to prove that drainage can actually be met. So an approval just keeps the train moving, so to speak. It does not absolve them or give any free pass that the drainage there is, one, able to handle, or two, will be constructed to a satisfactory means.
Oh, I like the fact that they're going to be developing out there. I think that's great. However, I think that many units may be a concern because of the drainage.
Right, so
Something we really need to take into consideration when they're doing this.
I have a question. It's my understanding that they've already developed the subdivision, right?
they've begun on Unit 1,
One.
the public improvements aspect, but no homes have been constructed yet.
Okay, so my question is, out of curiosity, is originally when they submitted this plat, was this issue brought up to them as a concern? Because
Drainage
You know what I mean?
is an issue across the city.
Correct.
So, yes.
Especially in that area.
With every plat, preliminary or final, we're concerned about drainage, from Cal Island to Flower Bluff to the island. So drainage is always first and foremost. Is the capacity there? Can the system handle it? And how much runoff is a specific plat going to generate? So just as we've dealt with other projects, we'll bring up the concern, and they have to essentially demonstrate to the city that
I guess
drainage can be met.
my also question is that this is something that they should have known from day one when they started to develop this pretty big project. I mean, it's 411 on phase one. I heard it's like, talking with one of the developers or guys, another 300 or 400 homes, if I'm not making a mistake. So I guess my confusion is, yes, I am concerned about this for sure, and I'm glad we're addressing this, but also, is this something that they should have addressed it maybe from the time that they started it, because they've already gone through the development process, the lots are almost ready, so is there, could they have done this differently in a better way to fix the drainage, for sure, but not address it at this time?
Well,
Or if they did not know about it?
It's all about the chain of events, how
Okay.
any property is developed. So someone can submit a preliminary plat. Now that we're reinstituting master preliminary plats, the discussion will happen even sooner. But the catch is that you don't have to turn in finalized utility plans till you get further in the process, to literally rubber meets the road at public improvement. So yes, we can bring it up, we can give all of our opinions and discussion and concerns, but ultimately, it's the onus is upon the engineer to demonstrate it can be done. So they can promise us, we'll fix it, no problem. But until those improvement plans are turned in and engineering signs off, not only our department engineer, but of course, Stormwater will take a peek at it too, does their word manifest
Forgive me
into
to
actual
ask this-
engineering?
Forgive me to ask this question, just for my own curiosity. From a development standpoint, right? From a developer standpoint, is this something that they were not aware of this issue? In other words, they're going through all this investment and cost and all that stuff. Right now, they're trying to get their final plat approved to start and sell the lots and all that. Could this happen to any other developer? Like, I just want to ask that question because, to me, I'm glad that we're talking about this because we know drainage and outfall is a constant issue all over the city. But was this something that this particular developer knew about this at the beginning, or is just something that happens now after
I
they've
couldn't
invested?
speculate when a developer specifically became aware of any issue, no different than they became aware that they have to build streets to a certain thickness or have to put in
Okay.
street lights every so often. The point of technical review committee is we issue the comments of these are the concerned items and where code is coming into play. That is our official, we are making you aware as city
Okay.
staff. They might have been aware, and they might not have been aware. That is where their engineer of record kind of carries the load of knowing how the design is supposed to happen at the civil stage all the way through.
And one
to
more question I have
improvements.
is this condition, is they giving him a time frame on it to meet
Well,
this condition?
the conditions of any plat is that they have to, the plat only is under current code good for 6 months. So if they don't address it, then the plat expires. Now, even though we're transitioning to having 1-year timeframes on expiration, that doesn't mean they just get to move on to the public improvements phase. They have to first demonstrate they have met the conditions of the plat itself. Now,
I see.
they can do that with public improvement plans, but they first have to check the box of, yes, I have met Planning Commission's conditional approval. Now I am officially submitting my public improvement plans as the next step in the process.
Got it, okay.
Andrew, quick question. As we
Yes, sir.
gravitated to these master plats, I think there was a caveat in there that, you know, as long as maybe the total number of lots doesn't change, that master plat's still valid, I guess, or I forget what the
Absolutely.
exact language is. But, you know, in a case like this where there's maybe a drainage issue, what's going to happen if, you know, phase 2 or phase 3 gets developed, and let's say they've got to do a several acre retainage pond to fix the drainage problem that's a condition, and then that's gonna reduce the number of lots that they can develop.
Absolutely.
How do things like that affect the master plat, which is kind of the direction that we're going, and what would happen in a situation? It's kind of
So,
a hypothetical, but just curious.
That's actually a great question. Master preliminaries, you just have to keep to a schedule of phasing. Now, that doesn't mean you can't amend that schedule. Preliminary plats are valid for 2 years, so even if you go past the master preliminary phase, you're into preliminary plats, let's say you have 3 units on this preliminary plat, you'll have a phasing schedule, but overall, you have a 2-year time frame to initiate the final plats for all 3 of those phases. If something were to change, you do have the opportunity to amend at that preliminary stage. At master preliminary, you would have to amend your phasing schedule to make sure that it stays valid. The question is, if I have 20 units and I'm giving a rough estimate, those last 5 units might take longer. I need to amend my phasing schedule. I need to come back to say, I need to make changes for drainage. I may have to have traffic impact issues. I might have just not enough area for retention. I mean, there could be all sorts of things that could pop up as you get that far. I always use Kings Crossing as an example. Unit 1 broke ground in 1985. Unit 31 didn't just happen until this century, so it's a long process. The point of master preliminary is that you keep some form of model that you're following. It doesn't mean it's set in stone. The whole point is like you said, we're not counting unit by unit. We're using things like density, but it's that you're keeping some form that you're sticking to. It's not just hodgepodge, because how else are we going to track the overall impact of drainage without a master preliminary?
Okay, Thank you. Any other questions for
I have a
staff?
question.
Yes, Commissioner.
You mentioned that they're working on Unit 1 already. Was the
Yes, sir.
plat for Unit 1 approved on a conditional basis as well?
Unit 1 was not conditional, and they're in the public improvements phase, because it could be at the point that there was not a drainage issue just for Unit 1, and that's why these are broken out separately. Unit 2 and Unit 3 might have to acquire a little bit, or they don't generate enough runoff yet, but if they get to Unit 12, Unit 13, that compounded runoff might get to a point that they have to, now they really have to acquire. It's not so much to kick the can down the road, it's to compartmentalize what is the true impact at this exact point in time. And we would highly encourage as staff always, if there is a problem, fix it now. Anticipate you're going to have full build out, so go ahead and take those steps. But there's a difference between recommending and requiring.
All right, thank you.
Yes, sir.
In the event that the engineer cannot prove that it can hold the capacity on the drainage, and they do have to acquire, are they acquiring that from another individual or the city, or?
More than likely, it would be from another individual, a surrounding property owner to, it
And
could be
is-
widening a ditch, it could be creating a retention area to slow down the amount of runoff as it goes into existing ditches, or finding a way, as Commissioner Schrader brought up, of how water might have to be pumped. I mean, there's
So like, for
Host of
example,
issues.
let's just say that the landowners did not want to sell to them and give them that additional, is there, regardless, is there a solution to this problem if, in the event the engineer cannot show, cannot satisfy the requirements?
not
Like a
that I'm an
retention
engineer,
pond,
but
or-
there's always a solution. It may not be a solution that the developer may want, meaning may have fewer units, may have to give up area that's
Some lots, give up
developable
some lots?
for retention.
Yeah,
So
okay.
the water has, what I would say is the water has to go somewhere. So
Exactly.
either you keep it on site, or you find a way that it meets the flow it's supposed to be to get to a public access point.
Okay.
But how they choose to solve the problem doesn't negate that they have to solve it. There still has to be a solution. It might not be what they would choose in the perfect world, but if they don't solve it, their plat expires. It's deemed denied if they don't meet the conditions. And if we as staff say, I'm sorry, you don't meet the conditions, they can challenge it, bring it right back to Planning Commission. They prove their case to say, this is how we're meeting the conditions. We as staff would say, not exactly. And then Planning Commission would have to choose which side. But 99% of the time, public improvements can prove that, yes, the conditions can be met. But again, it may not be the most favorable option to the developer.
Right, okay. Thank you.
One last question.
Yes, sir.
So does the builder have to prove that they can meet the conditions before construction starts?
Their engineer of record, so their engineer of record would submit drainage calculations to prove either how they're going to retain water, how water is going to access, essentially how is water going to go uphill to get to some of those areas, to get out of the I like the idea of calling it a bathtub, how to get out of the tub into a ditch. They might have to use underground. It's going to be an interesting proposal of how to meet drainage.
But just to clarify, until that information solved, there is no construction.
Oh, correct. No plat can be recorded, therefore no building permit can ever be issued.
That's my question, because talk about the issue of drainage throughout our city. I personally, in fact, had a conversation. I agree with it, so I was discussing this and looking at this perspective, then, because we're talking about thousands of homes coming in, and if every time it rains, we're gonna have the whole town goes on the water, it's not a practical way to. I
That's,
just want to make sure there's no constructions or any.
you're more of a planner than you realize. So that's sustainability planning and resiliency planning. What do we do to anticipate a storm event, and how can we plan to where we can recover after a storm event? And flooding is number one on that list.
We get a lot of rain all the time.
Yes, sir.
Okay, thank you.
All right, there's no more questions. I guess I'll open the public comment for item number 5. With there being none, I will close the public comment period and look for a motion. Andrew, just to confirm, we're handling these items separately, correct?
Yes, sir. As they're on the non-consent, we handle them
Okay.
each one individually.
Can I get a motion to approve item number 5 as presented by staff?
I'll move we approve item 5 as presented.
Second.
We have a motion and a second. All in favor, say aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? Okay. Moving on to item number 6.
Thank you, sir. Item number 6 is Cal Island South Unit 3. This is a final plat of 14.43 acres. Now, of course, conditional, same terms as the preliminary, and obviously we don't want to approve a final before a preliminary has been closed.
So the same discussion we had with the previous one applies to?
Yes, sir. Same
Unit 3 and Unit
conditions.
2.
Any questions for staff on item number 6? All right, I'd like to, at this time, open the public comment for item number 6. There being none, I will close the public comment period and look for a motion on item number 6 as presented by staff.
I move we approve item 6 as presented.
We have a motion and a second on item number 6. All in favor, say aye.
Aye.
Any opposed?
Aye.
All right, moving on to item number 7.
Thank you, sir. And lastly, item number 7, Cal Island South Unit 2, a final of 33.3 acres, also potentially for conditional approval, and will have the same conditions as items number 5 and number 6.
Are there any questions for staff on item number 7?
I'm just assuming it's the same concern.
Yes, sir.
Okay.
There being no questions for staff, I'll open up the public comment for item number 7. There being none, I will close the public comment hearing for item number 7 and look for a motion.
I move we approve item 7 as presented.
Second.
Motion and a second. All in favor for item number 7?
Aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? Motion carries. Moving on, we must have known it was a short agenda, so we got a training session for tonight.
I have to take advantage of it. This is the fun part. So this is where I thought we could either, I'll of course have a PowerPoint put together, but I want to keep this very informal, very conversational. Zoning isn't as much as I like to think. Platting to me is the most regimented of all types of current planning, where you have easements, you have utilities, you have all of these specific, that's more of the, I call it the math side of planning. Zoning is more of worlds of shades of gray, where we have to determine how do we classify uses, what zoning district do they belong in, do I call it six one way, half a dozen the other. That's why I'm always a big fan of zoning, because that's where you seem to have more of a direct impact. And of course, all of you know, you deal with that with every zoning case that's brought before you, and you get to see it go along the path for city council and as more questions and discussion happen. But nevertheless, always starting with the basics with zoning 101. Of course, I just wanted to go over just a quick framework of Development Services Department, how we're framed. As you know, we have essentially two sides to the house. You have our building side, which handles your building plan review, the permitting aspect, which is both over-the-counter, your quick turnaround permits, and of course your residential and commercial building permits, and then lastly inspections as you close out those construction projects. And then what I like to call our side of the house, land development, that is everything zoning, platting, and engineering. And engineering is exactly what we were just talking about a few moments ago, everything public improvements, meaning how are your utility lines going to be installed? Does it meet the conditions of the plat? Does it service the construction? Not all the time is it tied to a plat. Once in a while, you have public improvements that are actually tied to a building permit, meaning I've platted the property, I have my fire hydrant every 300 feet like I'm supposed to, but because I'm building a big warehouse, I need to sprinkler it, and I don't have a hydrant within 100 feet of my FTC connection. It's just a very fancy way of saying I need to add a hydrant somewhere. So I'll actually have a separate small version of public improvements just for that dogleg water line to put the hydrant to meet the building permit requirements, the International Fire Code. So there are times in which our sides of the house, red and blue make purple, and we bleed right in the middle. And it's important because that's how cross-communication happens, how we cross-train each other when plans are reviewed. Not everything fits in a box, but that's how our house is split. Now, when it comes to land development, again, our three legs of the stool are platting and zoning engineering. What you see every practically every planning commission is the consent agenda when it comes to plats. Plats that have gone through the technical review committee, they've been discussed with pretty much half of the departments in the city and have come to a form of resolution, meaning they can meet all of the service requirements, they meet fire capacities, you name it, it checks all of the boxes. Where zoning comes into play is, despite your property being platted, despite all the time, energy, and effort spent, it doesn't mean that you have the right zoning on your property to actually build the use of what your end goal is. So just because you've platted for a warehouse doesn't mean you have industrial zoning, and you'll have to go through a separate process. Now, we as staff always encourage everyone, do your zoning first. There's no sense in going through this entire platting process if your zoning has even a chance of failing. So zoning is where you're going to set the bare basics of, yes, I can build my project on X site. And then, of course, as I mentioned, engineering is more tied to platting than anything of public improvements. So what is the functions of zoning? When it comes to code administration, our everyday bread and butter is enforcement of the UDC, our favorite Unified Development Code, all 560 pages that have been with us since 2011. The great thing about the UDC is that before, and I still remember those days, we had 7 separate ordinances we would have to go through to review any building permit. And it was a nightmare because half of those ordinances didn't really talk to each other. So the UDC, even though half the time I'm surprised I still have hair and I haven't pulled it all out, it does at least create one resource that anybody can turn to and answer at least 95% of the questions. There are still a few that float in Municode and we have to refer to it, but I can always point to one document, one website, and send a customer there to say, your answer is here. I'll help you find it. You might have to dig through a few links, but it is there. Now, when it comes to text amendments, that is what we discover after either, as you've seen recently, the state legislature has made an action and we need to update our code at the municipal level. It could be we have discovered a repetitive issue. For example, special permits. I don't know how many times I've brought a special permit for a paint booth that's tied to a car dealership. I think I set the record at 6 special permits specifically for that issue. Or car washes, which I know is everyone's favorite discussion. But it became to a point that car washes and paint booths became special permit after special permit after special permit that we said, maybe we should just make this allowed in a specific zoning district with X amount of requirements attached to it, and that is done all through a text amendment. So it can be something as small as you now are required to only pave half of your front yard and you have to plant a tree now, or it could be something as big as this entire use of a car wash is now allowed in CN1, but you have to follow 5 conditions. So it can vary the gambit of all sorts of things. The next is zoning map changes, which is just a very fancy way of saying rezonings. This is, again, one of our bread and butter items. If I have a residential property and I want to build a commercial business, I have to rezone my property. And when it comes to that process, we as staff have to look at what is the surrounding neighborhood, our favorite future land use map, what does that say? And we look into that crystal ball of, will this rezoning work or will it not work, or can we give an alternative? And then lastly, boards and commissions. Of course, you as the Planning Commission, we have the Zoning Board of Adjustment, which I affectionately call the oops board. It's usually somebody has made a mistake and they're saying, please help me fix this, or they're asking to somehow deviate from the code on one specific item. The most common is usually either fuel tanks or I want to build my garage much larger than 50% the size of my house. And then Landmark Commission is our last, which Nina is our champion of. When it comes to Landmark Commission, that is all about historic preservation. And with our upcoming historic preservation plan, the Landmark Commission has taken a very active role. I'm very happy to say this is probably the most active Landmark Commission I have ever seen. So they are pushing for designating properties. They're absolutely pushing at all levels for more, I'm trying to look for the phrase, but putting historic preservation at a higher level of importance. It's not an afterthought. What happens is the only way it becomes an afterthought is because of demolition, and it needs to not be that way. We have a chance to preserve very important landmarks in this city, and we have to take that first step. So that is Landmark Commission's role. So what is zoning? I'm sure we could have probably a 2-hour debate on just what is zoning in itself, but it's actually a way of how federal, state, and local governments divide up land uses by zones to limit certain land uses within those designated zones. Essentially, if I have a residential zoning, I might only be able to build houses. If I have commercial zoning, I'll have a list of uses, and similar to industrial, I'll have a list of allowed uses in those specific districts. Now, how do those districts work? Now, back in the day, we used to have true cumulative zoning, meaning if I had heavy industrial zoning, I was allowed every other single use below that district. So it would, the first line in the old zoning ordinance said, if you have heavy industrial, you're allowed everything in light industrial. So you would turn to light industrial. If you have light industrial, allowed everything in general commercial, and you would go all the way down to farm rural. That's why across the city we have many houses in industrial zoning, we have many houses in office zoning for some reason, and even multifamily, high-density multifamily areas have single-family homes. It is a remnant of this style of zoning. It wasn't that it was wrong or it was incorrect. It was a very popular style when zoning was first enacted and lingered probably until the 80s. And as Corpus has caught up with the times, we are now looking at compartmentalizing. That is why residential is only allowed in residential. Multifamily typically is only in multifamily. You do allow a little bit in commercial, and then commercial uses are only allowed in those districts, and you go so on and so forth. That's why the color scheme now exists, pretty much to break up. Single family stays with single, multi is multi. You have various levels of commercial based on intensity. You might have something at commercial neighborhood office as something small as like a doctor's office, all the way up to general commercial, which could be acres of car dealership. It varies in intensity of the commercial use. And then, of course, light and heavy industrial. Corpus is no stranger to the industrial business because that is one of our major economic streams. So that is why you have Refinery Row and all of its associated uses will typically have light and heavy industrial zoning in those areas. Now, what is land use? I always like to say that zoning and land use are two sides of the same coin. One side is all about the district. What is it? What can I have there? What's allowed? Land use is how do you break apart all of those various uses into specific categories. So obviously, I like to use this section of Saratoga and Staples. One, it's one of the busiest intersections in the city, but two, it has a true, I don't want to call it mosaic of different types of land uses. You're surrounded by mixed use, which is your H-E-B, your Kohl's shopping center. You get into commercial where you have the Esplanade with various doctor's offices. You have a few apartment complexes. You have the edge of a golf course, which is your green park use. And then Spawn South is your dark blue, which stands for institution, which back in the day used to be called public, semi-public. I'm not sure why it changed. That seems to make more sense now going forward, what public, semi-public means. But nevertheless, you'll have a difference between existing. So one land use will tell you what is there today. And then, of course, as mentioned on here, future land use. That, again, that is our crystal ball. Every time we bring a zoning case, you'll always hear it's consistent with future land use, meaning the rezoning they're requesting is consistent with what we project this area either to become or to remain. So if I come in and say, tomorrow I would like to have general commercial here, our future land use shows multifamily and the adjacent zoning districts are also multifamily, we would more than likely recommend denial. No, it's not suited for that. It's not projected to be that. However, if I have a property that is here and it's currently zoned CN1 and they would like to general commercial, then we would look at what are the adjacent properties, what are all the types of uses that could go into general commercial, and would that make sense? The future land use obviously supports red for commercial, but then we get into that, what is the scale? I think I watched the case. I wasn't here for this planning commission, but there was a case about a parking lot off of Williams and storage for a car dealership. That was zoned neighborhood commercial. It's red on the map. You have general commercial around it. Now, does that inherently mean you say yes? Not necessarily, but it does weigh heavily on the deliberation process and how we as staff analyze, does that specific use fit in the harmony of the surrounding uses? And that is why we lean more towards special permit. That's to prevent it from becoming a permanent use, one, but two, it also keeps the onus on the property owner to keep up with maintenance of the property. So that's a whole other conversation about special permits. But any questions so far?
I just wanted to add to that. When we look at future land use, that's one of the factors that we look at. We also look at availability of utilities. We look at, other factors in addition to land
Traffic,
use.
that's a big one.
We look at current trends. So have there been some nearby rezonings that have recently occurred? So all of those things play into our recommendation, but we will notify you in our memo if it is not consistent with the land use map.
I do have a quick question.
Yes, please.
Regarding platting and zoning, you said that you recommend that developers rezone their property before they get a plat approved.
Sure.
Will you ever approve a plat that hasn't been rezoned properly?
Excellent question. So that's, it gets into a debate of, can I legitimately deny someone's plat based on their zoning district? So let's say, for example, and there's ways that you can say yes and can say no. The easy one is if I'm replatting to, let's say, a single-family subdivision and I'm zoned farm rural. When I draw out my subdivision, each one of those lots is obviously not going to be 5 acres to meet the minimum lot size. Very easy to say, no, you don't meet minimum lot size, you can't plat this property to that standard. Now, if I'm zoned general commercial and I want to rezone to light industrial for my use, light industrial doesn't, or nor general commercial has a minimum lot size. So I would not necessarily be able to stop a plat from happening based on land use. Even though I could tell them, look, you can't build your warehouse here. Even if you plat, your zoning won't allow it. I cannot stop the plat from happening. That's where you'll hear terms about if you remember a case not too long back where Planning Commission didn't want to take action on a plat, it still gets approved statutorily, meaning 30 days later, regardless of Planning Commission taking action, it gets approved. So it's probably plats are the most dangerous area where you have to be very extremely, but just happen to step out at the right time, very careful of when you deny a plat. It has to be for legitimate reason. Now, I can tell you 9 times out of 10, if a plat is even remotely has a chance of being denied, we make every attempt to solve that at the administrative level, meaning we have discussions about stormwater, or we have discussions about solid waste, and you'll hear the endless debate about hammerheads and how it's going to be serviced with fire apparatus. If we can solve it to make it easier for Planning Commission to make the decision, otherwise, if we as staff and the applicant come to an impasse, we always tell them, you can take your case to Planning Commission and plead, we feel that this is an onerous requirement and that we meet the letter, at least the spirit of the code. But we typically try to solve those problems and save you that debate. It's probably a long answer than what you're expecting, but it's a long story.
I have a question on related to, I guess, special permits. A couple of meetings back, I know typically on special permits you frame these in such a way that you leave it the more restrictive use and then put add requirements on to allow a specific use. Is there ever cases where it would make sense to allow the zoning that would be not the less restrict, but the zoning that say that the applicant is asking for, but put restrictions from the standpoint of if the issue is potential noise or visual screening or something like that, and just put the buffer requirements from the more restrictive use on that. Does that type of special permit ever make sense, or does that have too many pitfalls to do it that way?
It's not so much that, but we would have to enact what's called conditional zoning, and conditional zoning doesn't happen in the state of Texas. Now, there are ways other cities have gone about granting, or I should say, assigning specific provisions to a zoning case. As far as in the city of Corpus, special permits is that route. Now, the short version is, let's say I have a neighborhood commercial and I'm applying for general commercial for a restaurant. And the worry from the neighborhood is, well, we don't want a bar there. So can I give general commercial but put a restriction of no bars? No. Can I give general commercial and say, okay, if you put in a bar, you have to put in a bigger buffer yard? No, it's whatever the code will require because of that district. Now, if there's a chance a bar could come in, I could leave it neighborhood commercial and grant a special permit to say you can have your restaurant, and if you put in a bar, you have to meet these extra conditions. That is a possibility. It's not likely. Typically, we will try to whittle them down to the one specific use they want, simply because what I always try to think when writing a zoning case is I have to think not only from the day city council says yes, but all the way down the line to a certificate of occupancy is issued. So if I create too much of a chance of human error or something being misread at the review process or anything that could go wrong, I'm just opening that door. So that's why I try to limit it to just what is the one use you plan to have on that site, and these are the X conditions that are attached to it.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, so we're on the slide of special districts and overlays. So as you may know, we have districts within the city that are specific to a use, meaning you have a manufactured home district, you have an RV district, and of course you have things like cottages and clusters. Now, cottages and clusters are kind of funny because in the code you can actually have a specific base zoning. So let's say I want to do a cottage development and I'm zoned RM3. As long as I have a half acre, I don't have to rezone. I can use the development standards from cottages. Similar to townhouses. Townhouses technically are its own zoning district. But if I'm zoned RMAT and I can meet those minimum widths, I'm allowed to defer to the townhouse district and use those standards. So while they are listed as special districts within the code, that doesn't inherently mean you'll have to rezone. Now, RVs, manufactured homes, 99% of the time, you're going to have to rezone because there is not a time in which the code will say, if you have industrial zoning, you can put an RV park. It does have one of those specific overlays. Now, when it comes to overlay districts, as not so much a base zoning, but now something that you're going to place on top, I always equate it to your base zoning is your cake, your overlay is your icing. You might have things that are based on geography, meaning the island overlay, which is limited to just North Padre Island, from Whitecap all the way up to JFK Causeway, and it's only for the commercial zoning districts that hug either side of Park Road 22. That's where you have architectural standards, you have certain signage requirements, certain landscape requirements that you have to meet in addition to everything else the UDC requires because of that particular zoning district. You might have, as we just mentioned, special permits that were assigned as an overlay. Even though a special permit may grant a specific use, it's still going to keep its base zoning district of residential, commercial, what have you, and it still allows all the uses in that specific district. So even if you get a special permit for, let's say, a car wash, and you choose, no, I want to go ahead and build an office building, you can still do that if you have the ON district. Now, if you don't open the car wash within 6 months, of course, that SP half expires and comes off of the map, but you don't lose any rights that you've had because of your base zoning. And then lastly, historic or cultural. That is exactly where the Landmark Commission comes into play. When a property is designated as a landmark for either a historic or cultural reason, it will be assigned the H overlay as part of that rezoning. Now, of course, as we started to talk about rezonings, what are the types of factors? And I'm sure everyone has gone blind over time reading endless zoning reports, and you'll see we've tried to improve the format so it at least reads a little more clearly as you've received your packets, to where on the first page of now the zoning cases, you're seeing more of a profile of the property. Where is it located? What are the applicable plans? What is the traffic counts? What are the utilities that are involved? And the second half has now become more of our narrative of how does the zoning case meet or not meet comprehensive plan, meaning does it fit within the ADP? Does it meet future land use? What have you? That is our analysis half. So I say all of that is exactly what's considered. Those factors will consider the future land use plan, we'll consider the master plans, that is everything utility-wise. And then, of course, getting into the proposed use, how does that specific zoning fit into the harmony of the surrounding area? Are there specific limitations, meaning can the traffic be absorbed into that specific street that the zoning case fronts upon. Our favorite one to discuss is Yorktown. That seems to be very popular with rezoning right now, and Yorktown is currently only a two-lane road. We had this discussion with Slough Road, a very similar circumstance that happens all the time along Laguna Shores. Can Laguna Shores absorb specific rezonings? And then also with utilities, if there's only a lift station available with a force main for wastewater, should we approve an apartment complex on it? Obviously, it doesn't have wastewater service. Now, that doesn't inherently mean council is going to deny a rezoning because of an infrastructure issue, but it is one of those factors that we consider. In all transparency, we have to present the big picture of what's going on with a specific property, not just its compatibility with land use and the comp plan. And then lastly, I always say part of being a planner is like having a time machine. You have to know what was on a site, what is on a site, and what could be. So when you discuss a rezoning, you have to imagine at one point it was a farm, now it's an apartment complex. What could it be at the next step based on this rezoning? And you have to consider all of the uses allowed in that proposed zoning district. Any questions so far? I don't see anyone glazed over. I think we're okay. Okay. So enforcement and compliance, this is always everyone's favorite. Code enforcement, who is everyone's friend, I like to call them the property police, to make sure everyone's following the conditions of the UDC. So post rezoning, they're going by making sure fences aren't too tall, visibility triangles are obeyed, no one is building anything they shouldn't, everybody's pulled a permit, everyone's happy. Now, I like to call banks and title companies kind of our second set of eyes when it comes to enforcement. And you would be surprised how many phone calls I get every day about clouded titles and if so-and-so pulled a permit for a pool in their backyard that's so happens to now encroach in an easement. That's where we have to make a discussion, have a discussion about can that pool even exist? Was a permit pulled? Is it legal? Is it non-conforming? I can tell you some of these non-conforming questions will go far back in time to determine whether or not the chain of events happen makes it illegal or non-conforming. A short version of that is I had a property in Gardendale. Code enforcement and was trying to figure out, is it a non-conforming house or is it an illegal house? Going all the way back in the history of our codes to find out that in 1965 was the first year we decided on 5-foot side yard setbacks, just to find out that the house built in 72 was legal at the time, but when the property was replatted, the dividing lot line was put too close to the existing home. So is that non-conforming or is that illegal? I think they're still struggling with that discussion. I was leaning more towards on the non-conforming side since the house was already there and the line came in after the fact, but that's why I'm not an attorney, and we have Buck to help us with those tough questions. Going to compliance, so that is everything we handle in-house. So of course, after zoning is done, after platting is done, your public improvements are installed, you've submitted your building permit, we are now determining, do you check all the boxes of the UDC with your plans? And then afterwards, as part of that closeout with C of O, that's what starts the phase you'll see above, which is enforcement. So that is when things leave development services and move to code enforcement. Now, this was actually a few slides that I did for code enforcement themselves because I thought I would give you a sneak peek. What exactly do we do internally when we train other staff? I always call code those are my eyes on the street. That's how I know. When I talked about text amendments, I always say there are 3 things I have to consider when it comes to text amendments. Is it that the rule isn't being followed? Is it that the city, we're not educating folks on the rule? Or is it simply the rule doesn't work? That there are so many violations that we actually have to question. Is the violations occurring because simply the rule doesn't make any sense? Maybe it made sense 20 years ago, it doesn't make sense now. So that's why we train code enforcement to be our eyes on the street, to look at what are the most common violations that are happening and can we address them with the code? And can we save someone a violation by actually finding a way in the code to not necessarily just make it legal, but maybe make the path to compliance that much easier? Because I always tell folks, our goal is not to cite people. Our goal is not to just collect dollars and fines. Our goal is to achieve compliance. And sometimes maybe that bar was set too high or was made in an unreasonable way that folks just don't understand it. So can we make the process easier to achieve compliance? So all that being said, the UDC is that toolbook. So when it comes to, as I mentioned, comp plans, I call that the brain. That is the vision of the city, the area development plans, how areas should be zoned, what types of land uses should be there. The UDC, through platting and zoning, is how you enforce that vision. It is why zoning districts have a minimum lot size, why they have density requirements in multifamily, why only certain uses are allowed in industrial, and you have to buffer them from surrounding uses. All of that fits into the vision statements of the comp plan that say we should have neighborhoods that are separated away from noisy uses. That sounds great in a comp plan. How do you actually do it? You do it with buffer yards. That is the enforcement mechanism. So that is why I call it the brain and the muscle. Brain will think of the vision, muscle will actually enact. Now, what is the UDC? As I've shown code, it's not just 560 pages, but it is a guide. And as I said earlier, very much so, it used to be 7 separate ordinances we practically had to have memorized before the UDC even existed. And that's why the compilation started back then to house everything in one, I wouldn't say easy to read book, but definitely within one book. And then, of course, as we're going through the building permit process, how, every day when I look at a site plan, what am I looking for? I actually have a checklist that I follow of 15 items. These are the top 15 types of things that could go wrong in a site plan. Typical ones are landscaping, your lighting standards, which means, I'm sorry, you can't put in a giant spotlight that's going to blind your neighbors and they have to buy thermal curtains to block the light. There are lighting standards. That means you have to keep the cone of light on your site. You can't put periwinkles that are 3 inches tall and call that your landscaping. There are landscaping standards. You have to follow, of course, buffer yards. And then lastly, of course, are uses, meaning do you have the appropriate zoning to build the use that you actually want to construct? And then, of course, as I quickly went over the Board of Adjustment, those are 3 major items that can go to the board. You have variances where someone may or may not have already potentially committed a violation and they're finding relief, or they're asking to depart from that specific section of code. You could have a special use exception, and the predominant use in that sense, or that request, is I would like to build a bigger detached structure for my main house. You would be surprised how many car collectors there are in Corpus that want 5, 6, 7 car garages, and of course they have a smaller home. So to get above what we call the 50% rule, they'll go to the Board of Adjustment and ask for permission to build that larger detached structure. And then lastly are appeals of code interpretation, meaning I had a case to where an applicant believed that I was misinterpreting the buffer yard requirement for car washes, that I was setting too high of a standard. So the board had to make a decision of, did the city interpret the code correctly, or was the customer correct in that a code misinterpretation was occurring? Fortunately, they sided with the city. But it shows that an avenue is always there if somebody wants to challenge code. Of course, we always try to find an administrative way of solving the problem. I never pick up the phone and just say, if you don't like it, go to the board. No, it's, what is the issue? How can I help you with it? Can we find a middle ground that meets at least the spirit of the code? It doesn't mean you get away with murder, but it means that we had one situation to where someone had to put in a masonry wall and a gas line was simply too close to the property line. And so we found a way of, they were willing to put in an 8-foot wooden fence with the pickets almost having no gap. And it was a good middle ground. The intent of the buffer yard was still met with a solution that didn't require as deep of a pilings that could negatively affect the gas line, or wouldn't put weight on a water line, which we found that out with another property. So it's an everyday thing that we go through of compliance, and we try to save the Board of Adjustment a few cases, but nevertheless, that option is always there if someone wishes to officially challenge a code interpretation. That brings us to any questions. I know believe me, it's a lot of information. I've been doing this for 13 years, and I still struggle with keeping it straight. So never feel bad with calling us anytime, asking questions if you're not sure on a specific code provision or kind of our rationale when we make staff recommendations, both in and out of the meeting. Doesn't necessarily have to be about a specific case, but if you're just questioning, how does the city make a determination when it comes to traffic impact? We're always open for those questions and those discussions, because that is how we further refining the code that much more. And that's why we're in the process of a massive code amendment to cover those different items. Right now we're focusing on subdivisions, but we're going to be covering zoning districts. We have 32 zoning districts. Is that We're not Baskin Robbins. Is that 32 too many? Maybe we only need 27. Maybe we only need 20. That's part of that discussion of, do we really need 32 zoning districts? Is there an ability to consolidate, or maybe we need to create a specific one and remove another? Believe me, you're going to see all of these documents, and it's going to be a long discussion, but it's going to be fun, and this is how we move forward as a city.
Questions?
Can you go back one slide?
Sure.
So on the appeals process, is you can get interpretations prior to, that are, like when we have cases that are brought in here that the applicant is still would like to pursue what they're asking to pursue. You've advised them, or somebody on staff has advised them of what the options are, but also what you think might be likely to get passed, and are willing to present a case coming forward. But if so is that considered an interpretation at that time, or is the interpretation more a formal process that would be coming to Planning Commission?
I would probably agree with just the first half of the statement, meaning we present all the options. I'm always extremely careful about ever saying your odds are more favorable in a specific direction. Very early in my career, I was burned a few times doing that, thinking you're doing the right thing. You're trying to give folks a path of least resistance. But in all reality, you never know which way the Board of Adjustment is going to vote, which way the Planning Commission is going to recommend, and ultimately council. So I will never say, if you take CN1 district, you have a better chance of getting approved. All I can show them is here is a history of decisions that were made. These are the issues that surround a specific property, and these are the options at your disposal. We will always provide guidance, but I will, just very similar to someone asking me, if I move my driveway a little bit this way, do I meet code? I can show you the code. I can't design for you. I have to be very careful of overstepping that line. So very similarly, we do provide guidance. We do provide options. We tell them stories, just like I've told you tonight, of past experiences, but I can never say your odds are better if you choose X path.
So an applicant can also request an interpretation.
An official,
An
correct.
official interpretation. If they don't agree with that interpretation, then they can take it to the Zoning Board of Adjustment.
Okay, so that
As-
is an official process then?
That is an
Okay.
official process.
Okay.
That doesn't come before the Planning Commission. It goes straight from the written interpretation by staff, appealed straight to the ZBA.
Right,
Right.
sorry, I went sideways on that. So the case that I had was specifically about a fence, that the car wash was required to install a masonry fence because of a noise requirement, what are called noise generators. And the code says if you have drive-through lanes, then you have to build this masonry wall. Now, they were saying, well, we're not a drive-through, that's really stacking. It's a drive-through car wash. So my interpretation was, yes, it is a drive-through. You're driving through the car wash, you are waiting in queue, so you should have to put up the noise generator. And that's the case that was printed. So yes, I had to make an official staff interpretation of what the code says, how I'm interpreting it, and that's where Board of Adjustment has to decide whether or not my interpretation was correct.
Okay, thank you.
All right, no other questions? Thank you.
All right.
Nina, do we have a director's report tonight?
Yes, next meeting, staff will be presenting an update on the impact fee and master plan projects. So you'll be hearing that next meeting.
Anybody wish to add any future agenda items? All right, I'll take a motion to adjourn.
Motion we adjourn.
All right, all in favor?
Aye.
Anyone opposed? All right, we're done. Thank you.